My name is, as Mr. Sami said, Angus Keddie. I am a Hazop chair based in the UK with 10 years experience. And just to plug my company, a little bit, I work for Process Safety Matters, and that's a risk consultancy with clients such as Shell, Linde, Borouge, TCO, Ineos, Saudi Aramco, and Qatar Gas. So, does peacekeeping save lives? According to the research carried out by American academic Virginia Page Fortner, absolutely. In her book, Does Peacekeeping Work?, she analyzed the chronology following civil war ceasefires in the 1990s, where peacekeeping and peace enforcement missions were deployed in 36 cases, while not in the remaining 58. She discovered that peacekeeping reduces the risk of another war by around 60%. Before implementation of successful peace-kept ceasefires in civil wars such as Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, there were more than 1 million conflict-related deaths, which equates to hundreds of thousands of future lives saved by peacekeeping initiatives. Another question Fortner poses in her book is, if peacekeeping works, how does it do so? In this presentation, I review lessons learned from peacekeeping successes and failures to see if any could be mapped to the high hazard processing industries to help us maintain current process safety momentum. So the war on process safety started over 200 years ago. E.I. DuPont founded his eponymous company in 1802, setting up a gunpowder mill at Brandywine Creek in Delaware in the US. The initial years of manufacture were relatively incident-free. However, a serious explosion occurred in 1818, resulting in 34 deaths. The accident was investigated, conclusions drawn, and new safety measures put in place, including a plant site railway which ran on hydropower, not coal-fired steam, and also on wooden tracks. The cooling fans in machine repair workshop had blades of lacquered leather, and the machinist oil lamps burned whale oil instead of petroleum oil, which had a tendency to spit when burned. These measures were successful. 2 years later, there was another explosion, and as DuPont noted in his journal, nobody was injured, and it has proved a fair experiment that upon the plan on which our mills are now built, we have not to fear any general explosion like the one which happened here 2 years ago. The struggle against process risks had begun. So how was the war won? Well, ICI, a major UK-based manufacturer, which was a significant industrial force in the latter half of the 20th century, started in the 1950s to build and operate facilities which were larger and contained more hazard. Accordingly, when losses of that containment occurred, they did so with increasing impact. Indeed, the fatal accident rate frequency among workers doubled in the 8 years from 1960. Something had to be done. Something had to be done, and it was. Hazop was developed and preferred to inherently safer design as it was easier to adopt at a lower organizational level and therefore more likely to be successful. And it worked. Within 12 years, the fatal accident rate had been reduced by over 70%, meaning that ICI's implementation of Hazop and other supporting techniques saved around 50 future lives. In the subsequent decades of the 20th century, process safety was further enhanced by the development and implementation of such quantitative techniques as SIL and LOPA and legal paradigms such as a LARP. The process hazards were increasingly corralled and contained to the extent that, largely, I would argue, the war against process risks has been won. So according to its own website, the UN peacekeeping helps countries navigate the difficult path from conflict to peace. We have unique strengths, they say, including legitimacy, burden sharing, and an ability to deploy troops and police from around the world, integrating them with, civilian peacekeepers to address a range of mandates set by the UN Security Council and General Assembly. There are 105,000 people serving in UN peacekeeping operations. It has a budget of $8 billion and is active in 15 locations worldwide. Are there sufficient similarities between the belligerents in a civil war and the stakeholders and hazards in a high hazard processing operation. Let's consider the belligerent characteristics of process safety hazards. Pressurized, flammable and toxic hydrocarbons, risk to life. Size and strength matters, increasing consequence severity. Deficit of intelligence, hazards are not easily sensed. Predictable response to loss of containment, which is human nature. Hazards are often undetectable when they are contained, like rebels in a peace-kept conflict. So overlap in several areas, enough, I believe, to merit further investigation. In her book, Ms. Fortna describes 4 types of peacekeeping: observational, interpositional, multidimensional, and peace enforcement. Elsewhere, I came upon a 5th, transition assistance. Let's consider each type and see if there are any useful risk mappings. So observation missions consist of small contingents of military or civilian observers tasked with monitoring ceasefires, troop withdrawals, or other conditions outlined in the ceasefire agreement. Ms. Fortna argues that observation encourages compliance. It does this by increasing trust between the parties and gives frontline soldiers confidence that other protagonists in the conflict are respecting agreement. I believe that there are useful parallels in high hazard processing industries. Rasgas, the Qatari LNG producer, which was absorbed into Qatargas in 2019, ran an operator care program where operators were supported to act as owners of the equipment for which they were responsible. A key element of this program is a senior management encouragement of frontline decisions to stop production if they sense that things are not right. Interpositional. This type of operation is conducted as a means of keeping 2 opposing military forces apart in the aftermath of hostilities while negotiations for a peace agreement are in progress. This requires the interposition of an impartial force between the belligerents, the establishment of a buffer zone, and continuous monitoring of the agreement. The obvious process safety mapping here is verifying the safeguard barriers are commensurate with the product of the cause, likelihood, and consequence severity. Multidimensional. As Fortna states in her book, today's multidimensional peacekeeping operations are called upon not only to maintain peace and security, but also to facilitate the political process, protecting citizens, assist in disarmament, and much else. In high hazard processing industries, it is important to match the methodology to the scenario. For example, not always using Hazop because you're not aware of any of the alternatives. Peace enforcement refers to the use of military assets to enforce a peace against the will of the parties to a conflict when, for instance, a ceasefire has failed. Peace enforcement often exceeds the capacity of peacekeeping forces and is thus better executed by more heavily armed forces. A peace enforcement process risk mapping is BP's actions following Deepwater Horizon disaster. During the months which followed, the new CEO, Bob Dudley, who's only recently retired, instigated measures to address the root cause of the incident, including competence and capability development, the introduction of an additional term on process safety and systematic management at their Operations Academy for senior operations leaders, auditing their safety performance. By the end of 2010, BP Global Safety and Operations audit teams had completed 120 audits in total. More than 12,000 actions had been raised, of which 9,900 closed out. And then implementing the Bly report, recommendation 18 of which is to require hazard and operability reviews for surface gas and drilling fluid systems for all BP owned and BP contracted drilling rigs. And this was implemented by 2013. Transition assistance. This type of operation is initiated to support the transition of a country to peaceful conditions and an acceptable political struggle after a conflict, civil conflict, or struggle for independence or autonomy. The peacekeeping force attempts to effect an end to violence, to foster an environment in which the achievement of a negotiated settlement by the parties in conflict. The nature of risks in high hazard processing industries is never constant. Although key sectors therein are relatively mature, technology develops. For example, increased automation, hardware and software, with the associated risk of latent failures, cyber attacks, man-machine interface evolution. Furthermore, new HHPI sectors are created. So we have currently talk of a nascent hydrogen economy, and the risks have been amply demonstrated in 20th century airship disasters. So, parallels between UN peacekeeping and HHPI successes and failures. Successes, I will give one example of Sierra Leone. So the UN peacekeeping force that operated in Sierra Leone from 1999 to 2005 is hailed as a success. It was created to help implement a peace agreement after the country's devastating civil war. The UN Secretary General at that time, Ban Ki-moon, officially closed the office in 2014, calling it a triumph for the people of Sierra Leone after what had been a decade of warfare. He declared, "Our blue helmets disarmed more than 75,000 ex-fighters, including hundreds of child soldiers. The UN destroyed more than 42,000 weapons and 1.2 million rounds of ammunition." And I would argue that in spite of high-profile incidents such as Texas City and Deepwater Horizon, the application of learning and adherence to post-incident legislation from the 20th century has resulted in a low and stable fatal accident rate. How we act to keep the process safety peace, how we act now to keep the process safety peace will determine whether this can be sustained. A UN operation in Somalia is an example of a failure, which was hopefully learned from. And it was the first time the peacekeeping force had been used for humanitarian intervention. However, the peacekeepers were met with a hostile reception in Mogadishu. Several of them were killed, and the bodies of several US soldiers were paraded through the streets on the orders of Somali warlords. In these cases, there is significant press coverage, mostly due to their judgment that the readership, you and me, will be excited by the associated violence, death, and destruction. Psychological reaction to fear and excitement is very similar. In fact, high-grossing films were made about some of these scenarios. So with respect to peacekeeping, Black Hawk Down, 2001 receipts $171 million. And in our own industry, the Gulf of Mexico disaster, Deepwater Horizon, had receipts of $139 million. So, process safety related peacekeeping learning. This Fortna argues that peacekeepers can have a causal rather than spurious effect on the stability of peace if, one, they reduce the likelihood of aggression by raising the costs of war or the benefits of peace for the peace kept. Two, they disrupt spirals of fear and security dilemmas by reducing belligerents' uncertainty about each other's actions and intentions. Three, they prevent accidents from occurring or control them so that they do not escalate to war. And four, they deter or prevent one side from reneging on a political deal and excluding the other from power. I believe there are important ideas which flow from these tenets, which could help our 21st century process safety. So the first one, reducing likelihood of aggression, mapping to process risk intervention. We can leverage this by emphasizing the financial benefits of determining operators' optimal process safety return on investment, including the benefits of improved uptime, psychologically more positive, and personalizing future lives saved. So you could nominate a designated survivor. Ops would get to vote for a process safety champion when one future life is saved via bonus and recognition. Secondly, disrupting spirals of fear. Fortna found that UN observers were necessary because you need people to track movements and to do head counts on demobilizing troops and so on. One example involved the UN's monitoring of elite troops in Mozambique government hid in the Presidential Guard, part of the police force, as a hedge. This was discovered by the UN observers during a surprise inspection. In this case, mapping to process safety intervention might be setting up surprise inspections. These events would be publicized in advance and justified in terms of reflecting human nature. This is what we're all prone to, rather than lack of trust in workers. Prevented accidents can't escalate. So Fortna reported that the cooperation of Renamo leader Dhlakama was direct, involving cold hard cash. The UN bought Dhlakama's cooperation with millions of dollars in a trust fund nominally set up to help Tinamo, a faction in Mozambique's civil war, transform itself into a political party. An international observer of the peace process said he needed patronage to dole out, otherwise he would have been dead, literally. This helped to prevent infractions which could have escalated. Here, process risk intervention could be, for example, zero tolerance of fugitive emissions, with an operations bonus linked to numbers decrease, and a willingness to set a default bar in case of large-scale emissions in any one year. Also, funds need to be spent wisely and not necessarily logically or morally. You may have to do things which make you corporately uncomfortable, and then make sure you report on improvements made or be willing to change course if intervention proves unproductive. Preventing agreement reneging. I was contracted to close the action items from a Kurdistan-based early production facility in 2013. I was told that safety was paramount, but also that the startup schedule was immutable. For an organization which I perceive to have a production primacy culture, the application of a traffic light system enabled the identification and emphasis of critical actions, for example, where fatality plus was the ultimate consequence, to be closed before startup. This enabled process safety to be commensurate with other drivers, such as project critical path. Impactful company. Thank you, Mr. Sami. I'm almost finished. Impactful company tenets. Process and fundamental human nature are impervious to process risk intervention. However, organizational culture, structure, design philosophy, informing basis of design may not be. This may be easier to achieve where high hazard processing companies are privately or nationally owned, where the ultimate owner, a few individuals, a few politicians, are likely to be more engaged with any major PS incident than those of a PLC, multitudinous individuals and organizations. An example of this is INEOS. It's a $60 billion turnover high hazard processing company which operates in around 100 sites. And a monthly board meeting is held for each of the 20 subsidiaries, attended by the owners, including Jim Radcliffe, who is the founder. Always starts with safety, both personal and process. So Jim Radcliffe is acutely aware of safety, performance, and risk. So finally, in summing up, peacekeeping is not free. It costs money and personnel on the part of the international community and the countries that contribute troops. Sustaining the support for both civil war and HHPI intervention can only be helped when intervention success is apparent. So the metaphor learning intervention tools are that I believe that UN intervention in recent civil war ceasefires is imperfect but full metaphor for the current state of process safety in high hazard processing industries. There are several things we can learn from mapping relevant findings, the former, to optimization of the latter, including. Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you very much.